Many have said that Canada cannot afford to get into a trade war with the United States of America. Well, today we're going to talk about Trump 2.0 and how we should be navigating this turbulent time.
A clear path forward requires looking back and learning. Good public policy requires human connection. It's a consideration of the facts, applying common sense, and innovation. It's urban, it's rural, it's real life. We all have something to contribute. We all have a responsibility to get informed because there's a little piece of Canada in all of us, isn't there? Let's learn on this path together. This is Leaders on the Frontier.
Well, with me here today to talk about the whole issue of trade wars and relationships with the United States and understanding the new administration is our friend and colleague, Dr. Marco Navarro-Genie. Marco is the Vice President of Policy and Research at Frontier. So a warm welcome to you, Marco.
Thank you, David. It's good to be here.
Well, Marco, it's great to have you here because I know that you are, of course, a political scientist and you've observed this bilateral relationship closely. So I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned here as we talk about the new administration, the so-called Trump 2.0. And I would tell you, I find the scale, the depth, the velocity or speed of this administration really kind of stunning as they kind of redefine not just simply their own domestic policy with a flurry of executive orders, some 200 to boot here, but also the geopolitical scene internationally in our relationships with Canada. So I'm just curious, as you look at Canada's position, as we look at the new administration, I mean, you watched the inauguration as well and what's unfolding. What struck you about the inauguration of the new Trump administration?
Well, inaugurations are interesting moments, right? Because they're usually all about pomp and circumstance and a great deal of fluff. When you look at the vast majority of the inaugural addresses from presidents, they bring out great big ideas, usually things that make people feel warm and fuzzy and receptive of the message of the new president. Lots of mom and apple pie kind of messages. What was different about this one, aside from the fact, of course, that it was in very sort of close quarters, we haven't seen that since the second inauguration of Ronald Reagan. Inside the rotunda in the Capitol, it was a speech that was very, very heavy on policy details.
Indeed.
And that's an unusual thing.
So I think that's a very astute observation. It strikes me that we have a president here who's acting and taking charge as a president. Like it's been often said that so many presidents were almost floating along more as figureheads. They weren't really in charge. Do you think there's truth to that?
Well, Trump is his own man, no matter which way you cut it. And so he's going to fill the space around him in a big way. He already has in the first presidency, of course. I think we can see already a tamer kind of Donald Trump. He's still very much in charge. But his message, in spite of the fact that it was kind of detailing some of the things that he thinks went wrong or need correction, I think he was fairly temperate in his tone and in some of the accusations, for example, that he made in the first speech, in his first inaugural, as opposed to with this one. So Trump is a big personality. He's filling up this big office. But you can also already tell that he is a bit tamer and a bit more deliberate about the things he says.
So maybe we could look a little bit at some of these executive orders and the direction that you're sensing. And I mean, obviously the election was really defined by three electoral issues, certainly as I've looked at various polls, including, of course, the open border that needed to be corrected from the Biden administration. We had, secondly, getting and addressing affordability issues relative to the economy. And the third issue was really cultural wokeism. So what are you seeing? What are the key executive orders that have struck you as we've looked at this, some 200 executive orders?
Yeah, it's hard to put one's finger on it because, as you say, it's a massive number, and I will tell you, this is going to sound funny, but I'm not very much in favor of executive orders. In a liberal democracy, the whole point of a liberal democracy is that policy is debated in open fora, on the floor of the House, on the floor of the Senate, and so forth. But we live in such interesting times. Trump means what he says when he says that he wants things changed. And he's not going to wait around because he's had the experience of the first 4 years in which there were tons of obstacles kind of thrown in his way, procedural and otherwise. And so he is, with this sort of massive number of executive orders, he's trying to achieve two things. First, he is signaling that he means what he says, that he wants change done, and he's pushing through. The second one, of course, is that the massive number, the sheer number of these executive orders is going to shock or has already shocked the opposition. So people who might be opposed to the ideas and the policies in these orders are not going to have all that much time to react. And if they do react, they're going to have to be picky and choosy about the things that they react because it's such an overwhelming number that they couldn't possibly counteract all of them. So
No, I
back
think
to,
that's true.
yeah, so back to the sort of the core of your question about these sort of three areas. In on the cultural issue, if we start with the third one, I think you can see that the executive order essentially to sideline all the DEI officials and officers inside the federal government is a massive move. He hasn't fired anyone. He basically has placed them in some kind of administrative limbo with pay, pending perhaps some kind of deal and some kind of compensation or what have you. But as of the day that he was sworn in, the DEI policing aspect of the bureaucracy is pretty much stopped, and that's a remarkable thing to do. I'm sure there's tons of opposition that is coming his way, but it's already done. On the issue of America and America finding its new place in the world, Trump means to redefine the relationships between the United States and its closest allies, as well as some of its less friendly friends. Not to call them enemies, because we're not really technically at war. But if you look at the things that he said about, for example, the Panama Canal or Greenland, which have all sorts of people in a huff about it, I think that's a clear signal that he means to redefine America's place versus, for example, the Chinese and Chinese influence in this hemisphere, both in the Arctic as well as with the Panama Canal, and the essentially potential of China to interfere with America's trade routes through the canal. And so that sends a clear message to the Chinese that he means to change things and he's going to do it.
So I think that's a very good insight. So we're seeing rapidly before our eyes in a matter of days the assertion not only of key domestic policy to free up the economy, like getting rid of regulation, decreasing the size of the state, but also a reassertion of sovereignty. So, I mean, I think many Canadians are a little bit aghast or taken aback saying, why is he talking about the Panama Canal or Greenland or even Canada folding in as a 51st state of all things? So he's really trying, what is he trying to do there in your perspective?
Look, the Americans are concerned about the Arctic and its strategic position, not just as a passage, because of course, as a passage around the continent is not the easiest route, considering that it's under ice for 9-10 months out of the year. But it's the fact that the Russians have developed an enormous presence in the Arctic, and now they are letting the Chinese in. Some people speculate that that is a kind of a trade-off between the Russians and the Chinese, so that the Chinese lend more help with supplies and weapons in Ukraine. Be that as it may, the reality is there is a significant unchallenged presence of the Russians in the Arctic, and now the Chinese are coming in. And I'm sorry and sad to say that as far as Canada is concerned, we have done not very much, not to say nothing at all. And so the Americans are signaling to the Russians and to the Chinese, and also to Canadians, that in this vacuum they mean to enter and essentially try to push back their presence and their strategic situation. But that's also part of the trade routes issue, right? Because you can go and given the proper ships eventually, you could go around most not all year round, but most for a long time. And the second one is, look, about 15 years ago, the Chinese made big inroads in Nicaragua to open up a new canal to rival the Panama Canal.
Oh, interesting.
And they set up a consortium. They had seed money. They even broke ground some 15 years ago to start a new canal until things went wrong. And the people of Nicaragua balked at the idea for all sorts of environmental reasons and political reasons. And so the Chinese kind of pulled back. But they didn't just pull back from building a canal in Nicaragua. Instead, they just traveled a little further south and essentially took over the management of the Panama Canal. That is not a coincidence. They could not develop the canal in Nicaragua, so now they moved to control the management and the flow of the Panama Canal, which is essentially, again, potentially posing a threat to Canada and the United States and all this hemisphere and its flow of trade through the canal between the Pacific and the Atlantic and the Pacific traffic.
So what we're seeing then is, again, that underlines the reassertion by the American superpower that they will not tolerate any intrusions of other powers into this continental area, including the Panama Canal to Greenland. And that includes Canada.
Yeah, some people are drawing parallels between, of course, the Monroe Doctrine and what Trump is trying to do. The Monroe Doctrine goes back to the early 19th century, when the United States essentially declared that it would not tolerate the interference of foreign powers outside the powers of the hemisphere. In other words, that the inhabitants and the states of the American continent can move around and exert power on the American continent, but the Americans were signaling to the Brits and to the French that they would not allow for British or French interference in this hemisphere. And so Trump is kind of bringing that idea back alive. And it's not aimed at the Brits and it's not aimed at the French anymore. It's clearly aimed at the Russians and the Chinese.
Indeed. And I think the Panama Canal is a very interesting case study where the U.S. spent a tremendous amount of money, but also thousands of lives building that canal finally, given the incredible conditions. And, it was always agreed that that was a strategic asset for trade, critical to the United States and, in fact, much of the world here. So they're not going to tolerate the Chinese operating that canal, that's for sure. So there's other executive orders that have been made here that are, fascinating. You've highlighted a number of them. One of them relates to energy, freeing up energy in terms of regulations. You've got, obviously, the dealing with ensuring that the borders closed and managing migration. It's also interesting that they pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords. What's the significance of that in your mind, Marco?
It's both connected to the cultural idea of the end of wokeism as far as American policy is concerned, and at the same time signaling very, very, very strongly that the United States are not going to play in this sort of international game of environmentalism. this is kind of a funny one, right? Because you would think that what that says is that the Americans don't care about the environment. The reality is, for example, that in the last 10 years, the United States has reduced its emissions per capita far, far more than Canada, which has carbon taxes and all this nonsense about environmentalism. So the Americans are saying, again, also redefining those relationships between it and its allies, that they want nothing to do with, but essentially, and he called it a hoax. He said that all this climate hysteria is a bit of a hoax. I don't think that he's denying that the climate changes and that the weather changes and the patterns change. What he is essentially saying is the politics of climate change are at an end in the United States, at least while Trump is in office.
Exactly. I also noticed very assertive laws against the censorship industrial complex, where we know that there were, I believe it was some 88 U.S. agencies working hand in glove with technology companies and other media to censorship so many things. And so this seems like a tidal wave of change where they are not going to tolerate the administrative state basically suppressing free speech. Is that your read on it as well?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, right? Because one of the things that happened just the day before is that Twitter went off air, so to speak. Not Twitter, excuse me. TikTok went off air for a few hours, and there was all this recoil that TikTok had been banned in the United States, and there was all kinds of talk that the Chinese had shut it down. Anyway, regardless of all that, the reality is that. That happened exactly during still the previous administration, during Joe Biden, and then the President Trump came in and said, no, we're not gonna ban TikTok. We're not in the business of banning things, and that was quite interesting, considering that on the one hand he's trying to contain Chinese influence in American politics and the American market, and at the same time TikTok is clearly a Chinese product. And so he was sort of signaling that in spite of the fact that it is a Chinese product, that there is sufficient will that this free expression space that he's trying to open will remain open to everyone, including those that he suspects are not the best friends of the United States.
Indeed. So you see a lot of action on both the domestic scene, the international scene. If we had to step back for a moment, I mean, you're a political scientist, Marco. Would you say that the incoming Trump administration is really help us understand as Canadians what's going on here? Is it a reassertion of the people's voice in renewing the democratic institutions and economy of the United States? What's really going on here?
From the political point of view, I think it is a reassertion of the will of a big swath of the population that has been left behind. And look, we can jump back all the way to the first presidency of Barack Obama, for example, to sort of start to see sort of flares of this phenomenon. We might remember, some of us recall, that Obama's initial sort of staple message during his campaign was hope. And this always struck me as an interesting thing as a political scientist, because there are many virtues in the world of politics, but hope is a theological virtue, as you know, we all know. And so it's a big question mark. How does a politician deliver hope? When hope really, if we look at the book, defines hope as the yearning of things unseen. So how do you deliver that? So clearly, to me, there was a big disconnect between the expectation of the voters that Obama was going to deliver hope and the actual capacity of a politician to deliver hope. And surprise, surprise, we now know that there is a tremendous number of Americans who voted for Obama the first and the second time, who then became Trump voters. And ideologically, that kind of makes no sense at all, right? The Wall Street Journal had an article just on the heels of the election, analyzing all the counties in the United States, or several of the counties in the United States that had been Obama counties, and then they voted for Trump in the last three elections.
Interesting.
And that's a remarkable change. So, but the idea here is, going back to where we started, is that there is a significant portion of the population who feels left behind economically and socially. These are people who suffer dramatically more than the average American from all sorts of chronic diseases, from all sorts of social issues like divorce, and they're under huge debt. They have very poor health, and they feel left behind. And so Trump comes and says, "I know what the issue here is that these people have a profile. They are typically white. They're mostly rural or semi-rural inhabitants, and they're people who had jobs in industries that have begun to disappear." And so Trump has promised to restore the industries and the many of the things where these people earned their livelihood years and years ago. And so it's not quite hope. He's not using that language. What he's using is more tangible things that he's offering. And so the Trump phenomenon is essentially the recovery of that promise that Obama could not fulfill. And this is an issue in American politics because the sociology of that large portion of the population that feels left behind is essentially a betrayal of the promise of the American Republic, that everyone would be free and prosperous.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fascinating take on this as a movement. It's not about Donald Trump per se. He's very much a symbol and a leader of this movement that wants its voice to be heard again. And I think further to that is kind of a populist uprising against what is perceived as an elite that has been both incompetent and corrupt to some degree, that has not served the American people. They've been happy to outsource all kinds of manufacturing and other things that rightly or wrongly were outsourced. But yeah, this is a kind of an opportunity to rebuild the American dream, is it not?
Absolutely. Look, even if all these, I mean, you sort of lay down the opposite side, right? That at the other end of these people that have been left behind, there's this other class of Americans who are white-collar professionals, the laptop class, we learned to call them during COVID, who are thriving and they're doing very well. And so the contrast is significant. And look, it's not the first time in any country, certainly not in the United States, where there's been rich and poor, and they're all combined. What is interesting here is that the one party, namely the Democrats, have almost taken side with this sort of swath of the population that is doing really well and continues to do well, and have basically abandoned, largely because of all this woke politics, these people who are in rural America and middle America and formerly industrial America, right?
Exactly.
And so Trump has seized the opportunity. I think, some people, I'm not as cynical as to say that Trump is using them or that Trump is playing them. I think there is a kind of a symbiosis here in which these people needed somebody like Trump. If it wasn't Trump, it'd be somebody else, because somebody needs to take up the cause of these. And they're not two or three, right? There are a significant number of people in the United States. And in a democracy, power comes from the people. And so these are the people who have given power to President Trump.
Well, and I think what's remarkable is that the GOP, the grand old party, the Republican Party, has really reconstituted itself. It's almost been like a takeover of the GOP by the Make America Great movement that really is focused on the so-called popular movement, including working class people, and a seminal change in voters, which have been previously stalwart supporters of the Democratic Party, namely black voters as well as Hispanic voters, shifted remarkably towards the Make America Great movement. And I find that a fascinating phenomenon that is something that perhaps we as Canadians really don't hear about very often in our own media, do we?
Yeah, I think it was significant that the president went out of his way to thank the Asians, the Latinos, and the blacks in the United States for having basically been a very significant contributor to his victory.
Indeed, yes.
There was already, some support among the blacks and Latinos for Trump in the previous two elections. But from the last election to this one, the numbers doubled for blacks and Latinos supporting Trump. And so from that point of view, they are largely responsible for Trump's victory in the decisive way that he achieved this last victory.
So it's really quite a remarkable comeback for Donald Trump, and he had, of course, a stunning electoral victory, not only in terms of the popular electoral vote, but also he took over both houses of Congress, namely the House as well as the Senate, and of course the White House through the Electoral College. So it's
in every single
remarkable
swing state.
Every single swing state. In fact, I believe, if memory serves me correctly, every single state shifted towards the GOP without exception. So it truly is remarkable. So in that context, I guess part of the reason why we're talking about this is that within Canada, we have a trading relationship of enormous significance with the United States. And the body politic in Canada, as I've seen it and observed it, and this is really a question asking you, Marco, what your thoughts are, but it seems like our legacy media has really parroted the legacy media of the United States, which has really been joined at the hip with the Democratic Party. So what we've heard in Canada is a kind of a simplistic narrative it's all ad hominem attacks. It's all Orange Man bad. It's all Donald Trump is a Hitler-like figure. I mean, we just saw an image with Elon Musk, one of Donald Trump's supporters here, giving a enthusiastic, maybe awkward wave. And I mean, the best that they could come up with to criticize this was that somehow this guy's a fascist. I mean, this is absurd. So we're fed the steady diet in Canada, Marco, where we don't almost understand what's going on in the politics of our neighboring country. Or what are your thoughts?
I think what we're about to see will prove the point that I'm about to make is that the media seemingly is left-wing and woke, etc., because that's what we have seen in the last few years. Because the powers that be, those who were in office, essentially were forcing and bullying, we've seen it in the Twitter files, etc., that the federal government, both in the United States, and this is also true in Canada, in Canada was a bit of a carrot and a stick kind of approach because they were lathering billions, hundreds of millions of dollars on the mainstream media, while at the same time possibly they may have threatened one or two here and there. And in the United States, this was also true. We know now that the federal government was active in pushing media figures and personalities and networks into essentially pushing the narrative of the government. What is very interesting to me is that suddenly, now that the winds have changed, the political winds have changed in Washington, you're starting to see somebody like the Facebook guy. What is his name? His name just popped out of my mind. Zuckerberg, excuse me. Yes, thank you. Suddenly he's come to this epiphany, right? That maybe all these fact checkers, which fact checkers was a misnomer, is not the way to go. That we should open up the space and let people speak freely. it is not a coincidence that that took place within days after Donald Trump was elected. And I think that is sort of the primary example of what we are about to see. That the media in the United States is now going to swing the other way, in some ways slowly and in some ways more radically. And they're going to start singing praises to Trump and some of the things that Trump is doing, maybe subtly at the beginning, as I said. But I think we are about to see the same thing in Canada. Look, we have basically no government to speak of in Ottawa. There's no leadership really in Ottawa right now. The Prime Minister is a lame duck Prime Minister and then some. People around the world are making fun of him, not just Canadians. And you can see already that some outlets are beginning to ask tougher questions of the candidates running for the Liberal leadership. They're asking tougher questions about the economy and some of the things that have happened, and even compare some of the things that are happening in the United States. I don't think that's a coincidence. And so what we are seeing is not necessarily a press corps that is committed to a particular ideology. It may be in some cases, but by and large, I suspect that it is totally cynical business and nothing but. That they saw their bread and butter being their bread being buttered on one side of the fence, and now that things are switching, we're about to see a lot of the mainstream media starting to move the other way, perhaps even the CBC.
Okay, so the world continues to unfold, and I think this has been very helpful, Marco, to get your perspective on what's happening with the new administration as we as Canadians try to understand the politics, the landscape, if you will, in the United States. And it behooves us to go beyond these superficial analyses of Orange Man bad and vilifying people as Nazis as they wave their hands around enthusiastically. So the issue for me is, it seems like we've had a media that perhaps we need to bring a more critical view here that really hasn't served the body politic of Canada, because it seems like we've got to understand that Donald Trump is trying to renew the economy for his base that he's made promises to in terms of his electoral victory. Would that be a fair comment?
Yeah, I think the other aspect of this is that we have a mainstream media that is essentially moribund, right? It's kind of on its last legs in some respects because of all the challenges that new media have brought, and essentially the disappearance of large chunks of their revenue streams. So it shouldn't be surprising, therefore, that what they're trying to do really is trying to survive. And if survival means dropping their standards so that their audience grows, they will do that. If what they need to do is take money from government, which is an anathema in a liberal democracy, that a so-called free press is being essentially fed and nourished by the government, that is not a good thing. But that is a result of essentially the collapse of the model that we had about mainstream media, and that needs to work itself out. And for as long as it doesn't work itself out, they're going to try to game the system to get money from, whether it's from Orange Men or from Poilievre or from whoever else they think they can get money. And that's really that really sums up the trouble, that we're not going to get any better journalism for as long as they're willing to compromise their standards in order to survive.
No, that's a very interesting point, especially in the context that in Canada we have some 2,000 outlets that are funded in part, in a significant way, by the federal government. So this is the reality of our state of media relations, and it's these are very important estates where we need the media to speak truth to power. There's no doubt about it. So I think that's a very important observation you make.
And because they're trying to place this, not quite the partisan game, but they're trying to be cute and partisan in some way to in order to survive, they essentially used to contribute to sober analysis of what I would call the area in the middle between one party on the left and one party on the right, or different parties on different ends on the spectrum. So that space in between, the space in the middle, has been reduced because media are tilting one way or the other. And that is also not a great service to democratic discourse, and has contributed essentially to the polarization of political discourse at one end and at the other.
Yeah, well said. All right. So as we turn now to the reality of what's going on in the United States and understanding the Make America Great movement and what's happening, let's talk about the bilateral relationship with our neighbors, because we're trying to understand our neighbors so we can better manage the interests of Canada. And I think you wrote a brilliant article featured on the Frontier website called "Canada Can't Afford to Play Trade Chicken with the United States." I guess the first question I want to get, and you make a lot of very good points about this challenging time right now as Donald Trump threatens a 25% tariff on Canada in February, is the question, can you help us understand the significance of our trade relationship, the scale and the scope of it?
Canada has an enormous trade relation with the United States, and both countries are sort of semi-dependent on one another in this trade relationship. Of course, them to a lesser extent than us, because we're sort of a smaller economy and in terms of population, a smaller country. But just to give you an idea, right? It in terms of goods and services moving across the border, it is upwards of $900 billion. And in terms of investment, also added moving across the border from one side and the other, it is now north of $1 trillion, so more than 1,000 billion. This is no small potatoes. And so because we are the smaller partner and we are the ones that have the most to lose, we should be a little bit more careful about how we manage this relationship. It doesn't mean that we're weak. It doesn't mean that we're useless. You know, sometimes we have to be clever, and showing a little bit of weakness sometimes is the stronger thing to do, or the better thing to do. The reality is Trump has a bombastic personality, right? He talks a big game. We've seen this before, and some 8 or 9 years ago, when we had to negotiate or renegotiate NAFTA with him, we kind of went through this, and we came out okay. Ultimately, the Prime Minister was wise enough to get former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney to come to the rescue and sort of smoothen the bumpy parts and got it done. And look, we've survived the last 8 years or so under that particular regime. The problem is that Canada is now a much weaker economy in the last 9 years, right? Our dollar is down, our per capita income is down, our productivity is down, our debt is up. So objectively, all the markers that tell you that an economy is healthy or not tells us that Canada's economy is not very healthy, in spite of the talk and sort of the bravado and the brave face that the current government is putting on this. We are objectively a weaker economy. So paired to that, the Prime Minister, as I pointed out earlier, is kind of a sitting duck. There's no one speaking from Canada for Canada in a single voice. That has created a vacuum, of course, which we have seen several premiers have tried to sort of fill it, because the lives of so many Canadians who are also their constituents, not the physical lives, but the economic lives are at stake. And so people are trying to sort of fill this vacuum. This creates not just an asymmetrical situation in terms of the sizes of the economies, but it also creates a huge asymmetry in terms of the unity of the countries and the authority with which these negotiating partners have to bring to the table. And of course, Brian Mulroney has passed away, so he's not around, and he's not coming to save us.
So that's quite a far-reaching summary, kind of the state of the chessboard, if you will, as we play this 3D chess when it comes to trade relationships. And, as I do have a clip here I do want to share as Donald Trump summarizes, at least from his words, in a particular point of time, this whole relationship at this juncture.
But one thing we're going to be demanding is we're going to be demanding respect from other nations. Canada, we have a tremendous deficit with Canada. We're not going to have that anymore. We can't do it. I don't know if it's good for them. As you probably know, I say you can always become a state. And if you're a state, we won't have a deficit. We won't have to tariff you, et cetera, et cetera. But Canada has been very tough to deal with over the years. And it's not fair that we should have a $200 billion or $250 billion deficit. We don't need them to make our cars, and they make a lot of them. We don't need their lumber because we have our own forests, et cetera, et cetera. We don't need their oil and gas. We have more than anybody. So, just as an example, with Mexico, we're dealing with Mexico, I think, very well. And we just want to be treated fairly with other nations, because there's hardly a nation in the world, and I blame this on us, and I blame it on politicians that, for some reason, mostly it's stupidity, but you could also say other reasons, but mostly stupidity. They've allowed other nations to take advantage of the U.S., and we can't allow that to happen anymore. We have debt. It's a very small debt when you compare it to the value of the assets that we have, but we don't want to do that. We want to just have debt be obliterated, and we'll be able to do that fairly rapidly.
So there you have it. You have the President Donald J. Trump on January the 23rd summarizing his perspective to a particular audience, namely his voters and supporters, but signaling to Canada certain messages. And it almost sounds rhetorical, but what is the meaning? And obviously we don't know for sure, but I wanted to parse this a little bit. We hear the phrase, we just want to be treated fairly. He cites this idea of a trade deficit. And we don't need their lumber, their cars. Man, I thought we were neighbors. I thought we were interdependent here. And yet he's saying otherwise. So my question is, Marco, to you, what does this mean? Is this just negotiation tactics? Or is he wanting to shake things up and try to put everything on the table, from border security to, our contributions to NATO and security are lapse? What does this mean from your perspective, Marco?
Trump is a masterful negotiator, and one of the first things that he tries to do before he enters into negotiation with somebody else is throw them off their footing, so to speak, and divide and conquer. We saw that before, right? Where he just in the previous negotiations, NAFTA negotiations, he went and started negotiating with the Mexicans and left us out of the game. You notice, for example, that in spite of the fact that he declared the American border with Mexico to be in a state of emergency, he just finished saying in that clip that everything with Mexico is going very well.
Yeah.
Right? Because the aim is Canada, and what he means to do is destabilize this other partner before the negotiations. So that's sort of vintage Trump to try to do that. We should take that into consideration and not take it very personal, right? He's not about to annex this country, and this country is not about to let him annex it. Again, he's trying to get people all worked up. What is also true is that Trump places an enormous amount of importance on personal interactions. So we heard him say, I think was on the same day, if not the day after, that he's going to let Italy off the hook because he really likes Giorgia Meloni. Right? So all the other European countries are going to be slapped with tariffs and whatnot, but Italy is okay because Georgia is a great gal. That's how he sees it. Yeah. That really places an emphasis on the personal. And we know that he has no love for our prime minister, and he has no love for our former minister of finance.
Right.
So in part, that's kind of part of the game. But to go back to your question, the essence of your question is, he wants to have an advantage on these negotiations and throws us off balance. But you know, we also haven't been the greatest neighbors when it comes to dealing with the United States. We rely on them, and this is of our own doing, right? Because we have allowed ourselves to become more increasingly dependent on the economy of the United States, because a significant chunk of our exports, we basically have cut our noses and not allowed more pipelines and more means for our energy to be exported to other countries and diversify the clientele of our energy portfolio. So this is on us. The Americans didn't do that to us, nor did the Americans cut and reduce our military budget and our defense budget to what it is, and to the point where we're nearly not just unable to defend ourselves, we're not even able to send Canadian troops to play along in NATO exercises in Europe sometimes. So we have made ourselves dependent on the power of the United States to defend us, and we are, as I pointed out earlier, under some threat in the Arctic. And so this has emboldened somebody like Trump to say, these people, Canadians, are free riding on the American dime, right? Because we are under their protective umbrella on the United States. And this is not just bombastic, the bombastic personality speaking. Allow me to remind us that several months ago, when we had this UFO balloon, which later we identified to be of Chinese origin, going through the Canadian skies, the Canadian forces couldn't do anything. No one could do anything. We ended up having to rely on American planes to go and shut it down. So this is part of the thing that we have done to ourselves in the last sort of decade, that we have allowed to weaken ourselves diplomatically, militarily, and economically. And here we are. Now it's time to pay the piper.
Okay, so we've got to look critically at this issue and be a little bit more nuanced, in the sense that both Donald Trump is right and he's wrong, and we haven't done any favors to ourselves by being freeloaders on NATO. Perhaps our border needs to be fixed up, as we have, super hubs of fentanyl production in the Vancouver area is one case and example. But we have a lot of work to do to help strengthen our country. I mean, I marvel at this situation as they threaten tariffs on Canadian trade in the United States in February, when we don't even have free trade in our own country among provinces. Like, how silly is that, Marco?
Yeah, I find it kind of funny that 9 of the premiers and the prime minister have suddenly become great defenders of free trade, when for years and years they have opposed having free trade within the country, as you just pointed out, right? And by some pretty sober calculations coming from a few think tanks and some of the chartered banks in Canada, the economy of Canada could almost immediately increase by 5-7% and billions of dollars if we essentially got rid of all these barriers that we have in between the provinces, and there was free movement of goods and services and capital between inside the same country. This is also, by the way, a betrayal of the Canadian dream. When John A. Macdonald started to put together the first 4 colonies, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Upper and Lower Canada, the whole point was so that there could be freedom of movement of people and goods and services between the 4 components. And as we added more people, then that idea should have continued. Instead, we have developed a system in which we develop more and more barriers and more obstacles to people from other provinces trying to sell things in the province in which we live.
Exactly.
That's just plain wrong.
Yeah, it really is wrong. And it matters to Canadians, because this costs every Canadian thousands of dollars as we see our productivity decline, our standard of living decline, to a point where, I cite this stat all the time, but in Ontario, the average family is $25,000 less than the state of Arkansas. This is based on equal comparisons of exchange. So this is really a declining nation. So we've got to get our policy house in order and shame on a whole series of years of bad policy decisions from my perspective. So that's really kind of perhaps maybe the silver lining in all this is that it challenges us to get our policy house in order. Is that a fair comment, Marco?
Sure. One of the shocking ones, of course, is that the state of Texas, which has about 10 million people, 10 million less people than Canada, has a greater GDP, has a greater productivity than the whole of Canada and the 10 provinces, one single American state. This is a shameful situation.
It really is.
But as the Chinese like to say, crises are also the ushers of opportunity, and we can joke about this, but the reality is that some things that are good are going to come out of this. So, for example, we have seen already in the news that certain portions of the the Canadian-American border are now being patrolled by Black Hawk helicopters. We don't even have Black Hawk helicopters in the Canadian Forces, I don't think.
Remarkable.
We have rented these helicopters and are now sort of flying up and down the border with RCMP officers trying to police the border. This is not a bad thing. This is a good thing. And so the realization that we are essentially down and out economically, that we are a place where capital flees from as opposed to capital comes in, that we are a place in which we have become more and more impoverished. There's all these opportunities now to become not just better at defending our borders, but better at making our economies grow and creating the kinds of conditions that are going to bring Canada back to what we always thought should be a privileged place among nations.
Indeed. It is very humbling then, this kind of discussion, as we see these kinds of tweets. We see Donald Trump looking over the Rockies saying, wow, Canada should really fold in with the United States. To me, it almost begs existential questions. What's the point of this country if we can't get our leadership together and make wise public policy decisions that help build our standard of living? Like, we should be the most prosperous free nation on this planet because we have everything going for us. We've got incredible natural resources and know-how and people. So is the problem we have bad leadership and bad public policy in this country, Marco?
A combination of both, certainly. We've had very poor economic leadership because a lot of these economic issues are not very sexy, right? The Prime Minister has known since 2015, when he took the oath of office as Prime Minister, that there was a housing crisis, and he promised that he would do something, and there hasn't been a shortage of promises. What there has not been is the ability to deliver. And sadly and ironically, they are the government who talks about delivering for Canadians all the time. But the reality is they have not. And so this is a wake-up call also for Canadians to understand that we need to choose leaders who are capable. There is a difference between the walk and the talk, as we learned when we were children, right? People will say anything or write anything. Paper will take anything you want to put on. But the reality is that the proof is in the pudding. What actions, what experience, what is the record of this, that, or the other person? We need to start getting better at choosing the people who lead us. When you call a plumber into your house to come and do some work, you ask for references. You want to find out what they've done. And I mean, if you're like me, I ask them how many houses they have flooded. You want to know not just the great things that they have done, but where they have screwed up royally, because this is your household that you're trying to protect. We need to get better as Canadians are at asking the hard questions, and also at choosing merit. Merit is the thing. Because if we only choose people because of the great hair that they have, or the color of their socks, or because they talk a great talk and they look good on TV, that is not the the criteria to choose. We're not choosing a runway model. We're choosing people who are going to determine the future of our country, and as well as the day-to-day things that need to run. Passport offices, airports, roads, all those things that need to be taken care of. So I think it's important that as a culture and as a political culture, Canadians begin to develop a little bit more muscle.
Okay, so I think what you're saying, Marco, is you're onto something. You're challenging us as citizens to use our critical thinking skills to choose wisely in terms of leadership, principled leadership, and good public policy that serves Canada. So that's a challenge that all citizens can take to heart here. As we are now in this period of almost a kind of a national crisis of sorts, as people scurry around, I've never seen so many premiers and the prime minister try to huddle together to try to understand how do we prepare for this kind of imminent leveling of tariff that we think will do a lot of damage to our economy and our way of lives. The question is, how do we manage our Canadian unity here? It seems like this has been a stressful time where we've heard rhetoric directed at different parties, including even the Premier of Alberta, Daniel Smith, as somehow a traitor. And I guess I'm curious, what are your observations, and are you concerned about how we need to work as a unified country here?
I think we have to make a distinction between unified and speaking the same with the same words with the same voice. We are a plural country, a country of multiple voices, multiple reasons, multiple regions, excuse me, and multiple visions of what it is to be Canadian and what is best for the country. And so I think we should be wary of people telling us that there is only one way to look at Canada, and that's, the vision of whoever, one person or another. Worse still is that we're trying to rally around the economic vision of a man, and I don't mean this personally, but the record shows that the Prime Minister is an economic zero. He has no ability to make economic judgments, and that the economic decisions that he has made have been nearly disastrous for the country. So no wonder that the Premier of Alberta says, no, I'm not going to rally behind that kind of leadership, right? And she's got every right to. The reality is we shouldn't browbeat people into saying that something is right just because everybody else says it. That's not really the Canadian way, if you think about it, right? British Columbia has always towed its own line. Alberta and Saskatchewan, who are kind of similar in some respects, have a different way of looking at the country. This country is a country of regions. And so, but that kind of variety needs to be managed by somebody who understands the different interests and aggregate them. We don't have that kind of leadership in Ottawa at this time. We have a parliament that is not functioning, is being prorogued, but it wasn't functioning before that. Let's be serious about that. And so there is a crisis of leadership. The sad part is, and I think the former French revolutionaries were right to say that people have the government they deserve. And this is a kind of a punishment that we have inflicted upon ourselves. Trudeau was not inflicted on us. And I don't mean to pick on the Prime Minister, but the government that we have had for the last 9 years, nobody came and shoved it down our throat. We have chosen that government as a country. And it's a minority government, and there are all kinds of democratic issues there. But the point is, we put him there. And so we now have to bear with the consequences.
So as we make our way through our response to this threat of tariffs, I guess my question is, how do you see this larger situation in the sense that you were alluding to capital outflows, the enormous amount of money that has flowed out of Canada the last 10 years, I believe is well over $1 trillion. And this matters to Canadians because if you don't have that kind of investment in your country, and quite frankly, both money and the entrepreneurial class, among others, are leaving this country to elsewhere, largely to the United States, doesn't that create a dim future for our country if we don't have the businesses and the jobs to sustain our quality of life?
It does, and as we have seen, whatever economic growth we have managed in the last few years has been largely from government growth and government employment, right? So what we need to do is create the conditions under which people will be attracted to come back to Canada or come to Canada to begin
Yes.
with. And that doesn't happen overnight. The companies and the businesses that have already moved away have invested enormous amounts of money and energy to go and set up somewhere else. So if you're a Canadian company that went to set up in Texas, that seems to be the place of choice these days, in the last 2 years, you're not just going to pick up and turn on a dime and come back because of the promise that Canada is going to get better. We need to create the conditions and then show that those conditions are producing some kind of benefit and fruit.
You're right.
So that people can see that this is actually true, and so they're going to come back. So all that capital that has fled can come back, and some new one can come. But we need to be able to demonstrate to investors and to business people that Canada is open for business, as it were, and that we have the conditions under which they can thrive and grow.
I think you're absolutely right. So this is part of that policy reset where, frankly, not in all jurisdictions, but many jurisdictions in Canada are very hostile to business. And that is why business goes elsewhere. And it's a pretty humbling dynamic. So as the United States actually adopts pro-economic growth policies, this will certainly challenge us to do likewise. And I think the other thing that I find fascinating in terms of policy in Canada has been the war on Canadian oil and gas in this country. It's been a war that seeks to shut down that industry. It's really quite absurd because reliable, inexpensive energy has been foundational to our economic success. And yet this federal government has waged that war. Isn't it ironic that you have now a federal government, among other provinces, saying, well, the solution to this trade challenges with the Trump administration is to stop the export of energy to the United States? Am I misreading this?
No, this is one of those things that is totally contrary to what we're trying to do. First of all, most of the oil and gas industry is one of the most productive industries in the country. On a per capita basis, they produce the most value. So shutting them down is not good. In the article to which you alluded to, I try to compare the hydroelectric energy in Quebec with the oil and gas industry in Alberta, precisely because people are saying that everybody needs to do their part, and so Alberta needs to shut down its oil patch in order to fight the Trump tariffs. But the numbers are quite the contrast, right? So, for example, the amount of money and productivity that comes out of the oil patch in Alberta versus the contribution of the hydroelectric industry in Quebec are in tremendous contrast inside their own economies. So to give you an idea, Alberta exports 82% of the oil that it produces, and most of it goes directly to the United States. Quebec exports about 12% of its hydroelectricity, which altogether represents less than 3% of the entire value of the GDP of the Quebec economy, whereas Alberta's represents 27%. So
Remarkable.
if you shut down the entire hydroelectric machine in Quebec, well, you can't, obviously, but if you shut down the part that goes to the United States, that 3%, it's hardly perceptible. Right? No one will really notice, except maybe the Americans who aren't getting the extra electricity. But if you shut down the oil patch, which represents 27% of the income of the province of Alberta, it will essentially decapitate the Alberta economy. And so we're not talking apples to apples here. So
It will ruin,
this is
frankly, the country, as Canadian oil and gas collectively
Voila.
represent over 25% of our exports.
Exactly. So, and we're not just talking about the Alberta economy. We're talking about the contribution of the Alberta economy to the rest of the country, and all the monies that we use to buy social programs and equalization monies that move from one end of the country to the other, et cetera, et cetera. So it would be a remarkably stupid thing to do to advocate for the shutting down of the oil patch. And the wonder is, and the amazing thing is, that only one premier gets it, right? And so that tells you that no one is really looking objectively at the numbers, that we're playing politics, we're trying to swing numbers, and most of the proponents of getting into a war of trade with the United States are politicians who are doing very poorly in the polls.
Indeed. So part of the opportunity again is to work together as a team, but to be able to reset our policy so it serves a high growth economy, our standard of living, and all Canadians. And I think a stunning example of this, as we're alluding to, is that in the case of energy, because we have one primary customer, namely the United States, we are a price taker, not a price maker. We get we sell our energy on a discounted platform to the United States. In fact, frankly, that's where Donald Trump doesn't get it, in my humble opinion, is that the United States is an integral partner to energy because our energy is going at such a large number to the United States, even at a discounted level. So for us as Canadians, shame on our political class. Every one of them should be holding their heads low because we are not seeking more export markets and getting the full price of world market prices for our energy. This amounts to losses of hundreds of billions of dollars. I mean, I know it's a dynamic number, but shame on our country for not getting this policy issue right.
Yeah, I mean, we heard former Prime Minister Harper pointed out that yes, the Americans have a kind of a trade deficit. They buy more stuff than we buy from them, and so it's an advantageous kind of situation for Canadians. But also, it is the Canadian oil patch that is subsidizing the United States by, as you
Indeed.
pointed out,
Yeah.
selling oil for less. So the president isn't looking at that because he doesn't want to, right? And in the bigger picture, a lot of this bombastic stuff that he's talking about, that they don't need our cars and they don't need our oil and they don't need our lumber, is really a kind of threat, but it's a kind of threat that is in the future if it came to pass. Because the reality is, the United States could not fuel a good portion of its economy without Canadian products and Canadian resources. So
Indeed.
the best way to deal with this sort of nonsense situation, instead of having a trade war, is for people to sit down and talk turkey. Figure out what they need to do to make things work and make things work. But the last thing that anybody wants is a trade war. The Americans don't really want a trade war either, and neither do we. So we should stop banging on our chest and goading them into entering a serious trade war with us. I think that is the dumbest thing that Canadians can do.
All right. Well, I think you're onto something, Marco, and I agree with you that we don't want to play chicken when it comes to a trade war with our neighbor and friend and ally, the United States of America. So thank you so much, Marco, for joining us for this far-reaching conversation today.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.